We here at Level 1 are always talking about upgrading your networking equipment or your router or the forbidden router or something equally more insane or fun. And we've also got a series coming up on really getting started at Level 1 for replacing everything in your home network, because the stuff that your ISP gives you is junk. So look for that. But this video is about some creative off-label uses of stuff you can do from small form factor machines. This video is brought to you by EnGenius, which is what I use at home for my wireless, which is a very difficult situation. I love it, couldn't be happier. I've tested both the cloud managed and the on-premise managed EnGenius hardware, which is different, except for now we've got a newcomer to the EnGenius family, the EnGenius Fit line of devices. Here I've got the FIT 6 4x4 Wi-Fi 6 dual band indoor access point, EWS357-FIT. You should definitely check this one out. You should check out my full review, but this access point, 2.5 gigabit power over Ethernet, 2.5 gigabit Wi-Fi 6E. You can do 1.1 gigabit in the 2.4 gigahertz band, and let me tell you, this access point excels with a lot of old, crappy 2.4 gigahertz devices. Setting these up could not be easier, even for a mesh, and you don't have to decide how many devices you need in the mesh right now. You just take it out of the box, you take a picture of a QR code, and you're good to go. If you don't want to use your mobile phone, there is a web management portal. You can use that instead, or you can do total on-premise management, although at the time that I'm making this ad, that's not quite done yet, but that is one of the advertised features of the EnGenius Fit, is being able to manage it on premise. The underlying hardware that EnGenius has sort of co-opted for their product is extremely well built, and that's what drew me to EnGenius in the first place. So check out that ad, check out the new EnGenius Fit line. It may be more of a fit for what you're looking for. It doesn't have all of the features of the higher end access points, but they're also less expensive, but you still get that 4x4 antenna hardware. It's really just a software change. All right, on with the video. Now, the very first video that we did for Level 1 was about a small form factor system like this one. I think this is a 3rd or a 4th gen Intel system. This particular one's an i5, and these are pretty cool because you can get them for $10, $20, $30 at corporate surplus. This one I've outfitted with an Intel 80 gigabyte SATA SSD and a dual 1 gig network adapter. I also sent Barnacles one of these. Actually, I gave it to him at LTX like 2 years ago because he was sort of on the struggle bus with his router. And he couldn't find one that would switch at gigabit speeds, plus also provided VLANs, plus also did some other networking stuff. I don't know. You get fancy, and then pretty soon you're spending kind of a lot of money on a router. And this is literally made from e-waste and costs less than $100. Things have progressed a bit since that first video that we did. And this is still a viable option. There's really not a lot to do to add to that video. You should check it out. The thing that's happening here, though, is that a lot of ISPs are offering faster than 1 gigabit speeds. And a lot of these lower cost and older machines only have a network card in them that is 1 gigabit. In the other video, the true Level 1 series about your router and your Wi-Fi upgrades and the crap your ISP gives you, we didn't want to get super technical. This video is a little more technical and talks about when your internet speed really is faster than a gigabit. 5 gigabit, 2 gigabit for the new Google fiber, 2.5 gigabit in some areas, 2.5 gig is the Ethernet wireline speed. 5 gigabit is a bit less popular. Most of the interface speeds are 10 gigabit, and then the ISP will sort of control your speed to be less than 10 gigabit. They'll throttle you basically on a 10 gigabit connection, but it can be a little tricky to find a router that has a 2.5 gig connection. AT&T with their 5 gig rollout, they were one of the first, large quote unquote ISPs to roll that out. Of course, in Tennessee, we have the community and the co-op fiber that have been offering 10 gig service for like 5 years now. But for AT&T, their modem, they do it actually on a different local network, and their modem is still pretty craptacular. There's a 5 gigabit interface on it, and then it's got 3 1 gig interfaces. They couldn't even be bothered to the expense of having a couple of 2.5 gig interfaces. When you're paying for 5 gigabit internet, you can only use it on one port. And of course, finding a 5 gigabit switch, huge headache. And older 10 gigabit NICs don't really work properly with 2.5 or 5 gig. The oldest card you can do that on is the Intel X550, and it's not a guarantee. That NIC may not work properly at 2.5 or 5 gig, especially if it's running an older firmware, because you got to jump through hoops to install the firmware. That gets pretty technical. We covered that on the Level 1 forum. If you need help flashing that, come there. There's a thread, a how-to for being able to upgrade your X550. Intel doesn't even really call it firmware. They use their own terminology, and it's just all types of weird. If you're using something newer, like a Quantia chipset or a Marvell chipset, generally those do support 2.5 and 5 gig a little bit better if they're a 10 gig Ethernet adapter. Or you may have native 2.5 gig support right on your motherboard. Native 5 gig support's not really a thing yet, mostly. 2.5 gig, that's the i225V or the i225V2, which solves some bugs, and the V3, which solves some more bugs. And then there's the Realtek 2.5 gig chipset, which honestly, even though it's more CPU overhead, like it uses more CPU cycles to use the Realtek adapter versus the Intel adapter, Realtek has had less bugs than the Intel network thing. Hopefully Pat Gelsinger is going to fix all that because, ooh boy, fun times. So it does actually get a little dicey when you want to build a router that can do 2.5 gig or better. You can still use eWaste. So like our Dell eWaste here, we could slam an Intel X550 into this thing and we can get the firmware upgrade and jump through the hoops, and then bam, we can be rocking a router that can interface with our ISP's modem at 2.5 or 5 gig, assuming the firmware update works. It's a headache and it takes a lot of time, and most of the time your internet speed is only 2.5 gig. 2.5 gig NICs are pretty cheap. They're like $20. So looking on eBay, the X550 is like $100. It's not worth $100. It's worth like $20 or $25. It's an old card. It runs hot. And there's also the Intel X540. Forget about it. It's an older process. That card runs even hotter. It wasn't a good news card when it first came out. And this is like a decade later. So just let it go. Let it go. I see you in the audience rocking your Xeon E5602, 5603. Just let those E-series Xeons go too. None of that really matters. There is a low-cost option. Well, there is a low-cost option if you want small and sexy. This is the UM450 from Mini's forum. This is a Ryzen 4500U. It's 6 cores and 6 threads. It doesn't even do multi-threading, which is actually kind of a nice security thing. But it is fast. It is very, very fast, even though it's 6 cores. This processor will run circles around pretty much anything except application-specific ICs that are built specifically to run in routers. Generally, those will work faster. But if we're doing special purpose things and running our own operating system, something like this works really well. The problem with a lot of these small form factor machines, especially the inexpensive ones, this one's just about $200 if you get a bare bones one, is that it's only got the 2.5 gig LAN. Now you could use USB LANs, but USB generally is not built for 5 nines reliability, and I wouldn't really recommend that. Fortunately, there is a better solution. This, and adapters like this. This is an Intel 225V on an M key M.2. These are available in both M key and E key, which mean that you can pop out this Wi-Fi adapter and replace it with an Intel 2.5 gig NIC. You could replace this with a 10 gigabit NIC. There are 10 gig versions of this. You can replace this with an M.2 that actually has 2 Intel 225Vs on it, so dual 2.5 gig. And then all of a sudden you've got 2, maybe 3 2.5 gigabit interfaces in this tiny little package. Then the problem becomes, okay, I'm going to install your M.2. What do we do for our operating system storage? Well, these things also support SATA. So my plucky little 80 gigabyte Intel SSD, which this is single level cells. These are the most reliable flash you can get. That's why I'm using this. And we just pop this in here. It's actually designed for 2.5 inch SSD mounting. And then boom, 2, 3, 2.5 gigabit network interfaces. Dedicated network interfaces. We still do VLANs and stuff like that to have even more interfaces, but we can plug this into our ISP's connection and have our 2.5 gig interface. This will work with pfSense, it'll work with OpenSense, it'll work with OpenWRT, it'll work with pretty much anything under the sun because again, it's the Intel 225V that we're adding in. You can get the Realtek if you'd rather have the Realtek as opposed to the Intel 225V. There are eBay sellers selling the Realtek 2.5 gigabit Dragon chipset to augment the built-in Intel 2.5 gigabit NIC. An AMD 450 with an Intel NUC, yeah, that's just how we roll. You can get less expensive stuff that has a faster CPU. It doesn't have to be the one from Minis Forum, but I love this use case for the relatively inexpensive 450. Now if you get the bare bones version, it doesn't come with storage, which you don't need anyway, and it doesn't come with RAM. Harvest some RAM out of an old laptop. For this use case, you really don't need dual channel memory, but if you're doing intrusion detection or any kind of traffic analysis or packet analysis, it is useful to have the dual channel memory, but mostly you don't need it. 6 cores and 6 threads, is that enough to route 2.5 gigabit? That is plenty enough to route 2.5 gigabit. It's going to add minimal latency for your routing overhead and everything else, and arguably you'll be able to run more complicated firewall rules with this setup. Now you might be thinking, well, this isn't very convenient. I mean, this thing obviously wasn't designed for, like, how does the other network cable plug in? This thing is really compact, there's not a lot of room here. Well, you've got a 3D printer, don't you? Or you know somebody that's got one? Boom. Enter the 3D printable level 1 text replacement bottom for your Minis Forum machine. So you just 3D print this, you pop the PCB that comes with your M.2, single or dual port adapter files are available in there. You screw this into the bottom because, hey, the screw holes align, and boom, you've got your dual 45 gigabit at the rear of your Minis Forum UM450. And this thing screams when it's being used for this particular use case. Now, if you'd rather use your USB drive for your boot operating system or whatever, that's totally fine. That's not really recommended for pfSense or OpenSense. You totally can. It totally works. OpenWRT and router distributions of that ilk, that'll work a little better. But, you know, you got a SATA port. Use the SATA port. Plus also, if you put a bigger SATA drive in there, maybe you got a 200 or 500 gig SATA drive laying around, you can do some really big packet captures. You'd be surprised how chatty some of your applications are for different ports and hosts. If you're running something like Pi-hole, you can really capture a lot of information about the conversations your computer is trying to have when you're not there with advertisers or marketing beacons, etc., etc. If you're rocking things like an LG TV or a Samsung TV, you'd be surprised about how chatty those devices are. It's probably enough to make you just want to disconnect those from the internet or block them at the router level. And sometimes when you block them at the router level, they freak out trying to see if there's some sort of hole. It's like, oh, I've been blocked a little bit. And then all of a sudden, the number of servers they're connecting to and DNS and everything else goes way, way up. It's really interesting stuff if you like that sort of thing. And this kind of a setup with custom software will let you do stuff that you would never be able to do if you're a tech enthusiast or really interested in these kinds of things. On the quest for the perfect router, we're on the BIOS screen, which is kind of a worst case scenario, 17 watts. And we can see that our 2 Intel 225V NICs are perfectly detected. If you get the 3 NIC, you'd see 3 there, 3 i225Vs, or if you opted for the Realtek, you may or may not see it. Just depends, but it's right there, right in our Minis Forum UM450 BIOS. It is a buried option, but I do recommend setting the resume power after power loss, because that is under the AMD CBS menu, so be sure to turn that on. And we can see that our Intel SSD is being detected correctly. Now, if you don't want to use the 3D printable replacement bottom for your Minis Forum PC, which does fit a lot more than just the UM450 if you wanted to get something higher end, but truthfully, the UM450 for this use case is kind of overkill. I mean, you don't need 16 gigabytes of memory for this. 8 would be plenty. Then, you could just notch out the rear case for the cables and just have a little pigtail for your second NIC, or second and third NIC, depending on which way you want to rock. From here, it's just a question of software, and a USB stick with OpenSense or pfSense will be pretty easy to install. We'll go through OpenSense real quick. I'm assuming you know how to make a USB installer once you get your USB installer created. From there, it's pretty easy. We're just going to plug it in. Installation is pretty straightforward. You can use it on a live USB if you don't want to install it to the hard drive, like I say, but it's more supported on the OpenSense side than the pfSense side, but really I would recommend you just go ahead and install it to the SATA hard drive. I wouldn't have bothered showing you how to do that. The password is OpenSense, OPNSENSE, all lowercase by default, and the username that you want to use for the installer is installer, which when you log in as installer, it starts the installer. Makes sense? You probably also want to start it with no network connected at all, because depending on flip of a coin, roll the dice, if it's plugged into the network, it could start its own DHCP server, which could conflict with your local DHCP server. It could cause problems. Just don't plug in the network when you're setting it up. If you just want something that's easy and goes fast, you don't really need this level of technical detail. You don't have to worry about it to this level. But if you're curious about that kind of thing, come to the Level 1 forum for like-minded individuals. Let's touch base. Let's have a powwow. Let's get together. Let's figure out what sort of scratches the itch that you have. Because I've got it too. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums. I'll find you in the Level 1 forums. You'll find me in the Level 1 forums. I think that's how that goes. It's 3D printable! What's not to love?